Welcome to the 4D Talks, a series of brainstorm sessions with people who perceive architecture beyond the three dimensions. The goal of this meeting is to discuss what these fourth dimensions of architecture can be and how much they impact the built environment. Today, we're going to talk about senses with an expert in this topic, Professor of Experimental Psychology, Charles Spence. Charles focuses on multisensory experiences of a human and how understanding of them can lead to better design of everything that surrounds us, like food, products, environments, as well as architecture. Hello, Charles. Thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So my idea about the talk today is to really dive deep into all the senses separately and then brainstorm on how we can use them in architecture to maximum. But as a start, I think we could maybe try to explain first why we should be even considering senses as one of the dimensions in architecture. So why is it important to design with them and for them, and to what extent they affect our experience? So it seems to me like we often don't really talk about them and we don't really use them. They're often overlooked in design until they affect us negatively, like with overstimulation or lack of some kind of stimulation, right? What could you tell us about that, these negative sort of experiences that we can have?
So I guess we spend most of our lives indoors. Figures say something like 95%. It's hard to believe it's true, but again and again the surveys say we spend 95% of our lives indoors, and hence we are always surrounded by the built environment. And that environment, that architecture that surrounds and protects us, stimulates or doesn't our senses, at least the four main ones, I guess, sort of touch, sound, smell, and what is most often focused on and only focused on vision. And I think, our brain is always, I come to you as a psychologist, interested in the brain and the senses and its application of those insights to the real world. And I think the built environment that surrounds us, that stimulates our senses, there's often in the background of our experience, but nevertheless our brain sort of picks up the cues about temperature and scent, which might encourage us to approach or to avoid. Sometimes in our awareness, we're aware of the environment we're in. It smells a funny way, smells strange or funny or great. But other times, our brain's picking up those environmental cues without really letting us in terms of awareness. They're sort of picked up in the background, subconsciously, if you will. And where they can very often lead to problems when the senses aren't stimulated in a good way, in a balanced way, I guess you'd say. And I suppose we evolved to live out there in nature, perhaps in the Ethiopian highlands with a certain temperature, a certain sort of natural light, certain scent, certain sounds, and the built environment very often takes us away from that sort of sensory balance. Maybe we get, especially in northern European climates, we may get less natural light than we evolved to be optimized for, and that can lead to problems of light hunger. There are often reports of sick building or sick home syndrome, SBS or SHS.
Could you explain a little bit more what that is?
So it's sort of a phenomenon that I think really sort of emerged in the 1970s in the States. Interestingly, during the last kind of major fuel crisis, when the cost of air conditioning and such like got very expensive because of energy prices going up, and so there's sort of poor ventilation, we think in hindsight. So very sort of relevant today as energy prices go up again. And it's the name given initially sick building syndrome to these sort of initially unexplained phenomena of office buildings in the States, where suddenly thousands of workers would come down with a range of symptoms, sort of facial irritation, eye irritation, headaches, dry skin, and so on. And some aren't sort of clear whether this is a real phenomenon or not. Mm-hmm. But certainly those who experience it, and it tends to come in waves, believe it to affect them negatively. And this SBS, sick building syndrome, then has been, people think it's sort of triggered by something strange in the olfactory environment, certain strange smell. Nowadays, and it was quite often reported in the 70s with the energy crisis, sort of gone down a bit, but nowadays you see it a lot more in terms of sick building syndrome. So again, those in northern climates, especially in Scandinavia, in the home environment where there may be a shortage of natural light in the winter months, a lack of natural ventilation, and perhaps some volatile organic chemicals or compounds from the building materials, or possibly mold or other stuff in the atmosphere, at the border of being perceptible or not consciously. But nevertheless, our brain picks up those olfactory signatures and says sort of danger or warning, and this leads to these negative health consequences as a result. So that would be, light hunger from a lack of natural light in the sort of built environment, especially in winter, especially in northern climates, leading to hundreds of millions of pounds in sort of lost revenue in the UK alone. Then we have the sick building syndrome linked to an imbalance or inappropriate stimulation of the sense of smell. Then we would have sort of sound, and there many interior environments are incredibly noisy, especially bars, cafeterias, restaurants. But also, I see increasingly open plan offices, where
acoustics is one of the main issues that we're also dealing with in the
and it's also that noise, so that unpleasant sound from other people's conversations and activities that leads to estimating a loss of almost an hour in productivity per day. Of course, I guess the accountants and the office managers like it 'cause it's sort of flexible system, and it seems to be more efficient to have more people in a smaller space. And yet the sort of psychology literature says no, it's a bad thing. And again, in those open plan environments, it tends to be the noise that's the primary complaint of people. It's not other people's smells necessarily or body odors. It's not that any change in lighting. It's just the noise that sort of distracts. So again, a third sense that sort of has a problem. And then we might think about the sense of the skin, or the sense of touch. And probably there it's more, I think, about temperature.
Yeah, that's something that we can really relate to these days. It's hot, and people's productivity in our office just dropped incredibly.
Again, a couple of things really. One is from one of the studies I reviewed recently around, if you look at the kind of the ambient temperature and humidity levels that North Americans choose for their own homes, being like a citizen science study, going all the way from Alaska down to Texas and Florida, from hot to cold, and then you correlate those indoor home environment temperatures and humidities with global temperatures and humidities around the world. It turns out they're most similar to the climatic conditions in the Ethiopian highlands, so where we evolved 5 million years ago. So we're trying to recreate, in some sense, when we're given the choice, this environment. And of course, from what I've read, the office guidelines are how should we choose to think about the thermal comfort and conditions in the built environment. Then the guidelines tend to be set for middle-aged North American male men. And as most people, I guess, are aware, men and women have different preferences regarding.
Actually, right? It's a couple of degrees.
It's like 2 or 3 degrees centigrade difference between what is optimal. Not only what is most thermally comfortable for in the extreme is a North American, probably overweight white male versus a Japanese woman. We get sort of the biggest contrast of 3 degrees. Not only does that affect thermal comfort, but then it also affects productivity as well. And so, sort of living in this sort of gendered thermal environment in a way that is, perfect for somebody, but not for half the workforce. And so, how do you sort that out? But again, it's that's the fourth sense, and the kind of sense of touch detected through the skin that is leading to problems of reduced productivity through being the environment being set at a temperature that's not ideal for me.
Yeah, gender equality is, I think, a separate topic for another 4D talk. Okay, we talked about negative effects, and so let's try to maybe say something positive about senses. Let's start with the sense of smell, which I think is crucial when it comes to creating memories, right? So I see a huge potential here for instance, placemaking strategies. How important it is, in your opinion, from a more psychologist point of view, when it comes to designing with smell and for sense of smell?
So I think so smell is not top of most people's lists of the most important sense. Yet, if we do lose one sense, then losing the sense of smell leads to the biggest increase in suicide of all the senses, suggesting this kind of unrecognized connection to emotional life, to the pleasures of the table, but also to sort of social interaction as well. So it's kind of one of these more or less unconscious, unrecognized senses, and yet very important. And have over the last couple of years been writing a whole series of papers around scent-attainment. I want to call it sort of scent and entertainment, but scent in the built environment through its use in cinema, through theme parks and casinos and transport, but also the built environment, and thinking about how it can potentially be used to enhance well-being. So the flip side almost of the sick building syndrome. I guess the way I'm thinking about it is, I mean, there's been a long sort of history of talk about sort of aromatherapy, which has been more or less scientifically respectable as the decades have gone by. But I think today, people do, the scientists included, recognize the potential benefits for well-being of certain aromatherapy scents, whether that's because of the essential oils or whether a synthetic copy would do as good a job. I don't want to get into. I think probably both do as well. And in this sort of paper I just published on sort of scent in the built environment and scent and well-being, what I found was that yes, ambient scents, in particular, very often aromatherapy scents, so the sense of nature in a way, can improve well-being, can modulate our relaxation arousal levels, and I sort of like to think of it as almost the olfactory nature effect in a way. That we evolved in a certain environment. The built environment today takes us away from that natural balance of our senses and stimulation, and anything we can do to, in some sense, reproduce or simulate elements of that ancient environment will probably make us happier. And that gets you sort of biophilia in terms of putting plants in the built environment. I can see a couple behind you right there. But I think thinking about aromatherapy or thinking about scent as the olfactory nature effect suddenly sort of connects these two areas together. And from my review of the literature, what I found was that ambient scent doesn't always improve well-being, but when it does, it tends to be at times when people are stressed to begin with. So with the COVID pandemic, with the Ukraine and field crisis, whatever else, there are probably a few times that people have been as stressed as they are now, and then it will be a sort of perfect opportunity to use those olfactory cues, perhaps triggering links to nature to improve relaxation, well-being, and from the sort of corporate side, what I'm also seeing is a growth in sort of signature scents of space, and that was for a few years, hotel chains like Westin having their signature scent, but now it's even sporting venues. One might think about shopping centres. Could they have a scent, and what should that scent be? Should it be a signature scent, so recognizably of this brand, of this group, of this organization? And then beyond that, can we develop those sort of signature scents that are also functional, that they do something good, that they improve well-being? If it's a hotel and an airport, when people are arriving after a long-haul flight, how can you use scent to help calm and stressed travelers, or improve sleep quality in the rooms, or trigger memories and nostalgia after people have left a space or a venue? So I think a lot of opportunity there to more creatively use scent.
So we could be really talking about using them also in hospitals, sort of shortening maybe the periods of recovery as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Although my sort of core belief would be that there are very few scents that we have an innate response to. That most of our responses to scents and aromas are learnt. So I do see work in sort of sensory well-being that's been taken up in the private and occasionally in the public health sector, and in sort of dentist surgeries, these places, hospitals and dentists that have a particular smell. For the dentist, it's kind of that eugenol smell of cloves from the fillings, and that gets people stressed, anxious, and that leads to maybe more pain, more stress, more tension, perhaps slower recovery. And so in that sort of context, there's nothing intrinsically stressful about eugenol clove smell. It's only because we've experienced it in that context before. And hence that, when you think about the healthcare case, I guess the solution would have to be, to kind of change the scent every 6 months. So not to have a signature scent, but in fact, so every time you go there are no prior associations with this smell. It's new. So maybe it's eugenol now. In 6 months, it's orange scent, which has been tried in some dentist surgeries. A year later, it's something else. And that way, there's nothing to really tap for the patient or the visitor or the customer, whatever they're called these days, to latch onto and become stressed by.
Fascinating. I think it's the next sense, the sense of touch, that I would like to discuss is somehow connected with this, with the sense of smell, in terms of, well, for example, when we use wood, we get both from it, right? We get a bit of the special smell of wood, especially fresh wood. But I think when we talk about the sense of touch in architecture, we don't really realize how many of those connection points with architecture we actually have per day, right? You mentioned also in your article all these elements like handrails, buttons, pushing doors, exactly, which also we should maybe put more effort designing in order to create this experience more pleasant. Also from the, we already talked about the temperature, so we can sort of create this feeling of coziness, or on the other hand, we're dealing with overheating or overcooling, right?
So I guess the sense of touch is our skin surface, richly embedded with receptors for pressure, temperature, vibration, and so on. Pleasant touch. This is our biggest sense, and 18 to 20% of our body mass given over to the skin surface alone. And so that question is, what are you doing to optimally simulate the sense of touch of your inhabitants or visitors or customers? I think is a very salient one. I guess, that on the one hand, there is a thermal comfort aspect, and then separately, there is the sort of the feel of the space. And that can be through those literal sensory touch points that, where does the inhabitant of this architectural space, what do they actually touch? And that's going to be the door knobs, perhaps the chairs they sit in, the desks they sit at. And then, of course, I think beyond the actual touch of surfaces, there's also the obviously imagined or multi-sensory. So when I see a textured surface, a wall, a piece of wood, I guess my brain is imagining, simulating the act of touching it. So even though I don't actually touch it myself, simply through seeing a textured surface, perhaps a natural surface, my brain is imagining the act of touching, simulating the act of touching it. And hence you kind of get this, it's almost cross-modal touch or tactile stimulation as well. Again, coming back to the, what would the tactile nature effect be? Maybe it's around sort of natural surfaces, unevenness, unpredictability, probably not the smooth clinical surfaces that so often we surround ourselves with, both those that we actually touch and interact with, and those that we merely see on surfaces that we might not touch with. I guess there are fewer moments in our experience of a building where we actually touch of it, and maybe there's a more limited palette of things that you can do. But nevertheless, I think it is important, given it is our biggest sense.
But can we be talking here about overstimulation, or that's actually the sense that the more the better?
I want to say generally that while many people talk, report, complain of sensory overload, especially in the built environment, especially in the cities, when you look at it more carefully, it seems to be a sensory imbalance. Noise, too much visual information, too many alerts, too many messages, too much. But it's a higher rational senses of hearing and vision that tend to be overstimulated. And it's rare to find somebody says, I'm getting too many smells today. God, it's just too much touch, too many tastes. I've never heard anyone complain about those. And so it's like an imbalance. There's an overstimulation of the higher rational senses, and I think an understimulation of the more emotional senses, in which I'd include, touch and smell and taste. So in that sense, one doesn't really come back across an overstimulation of people complaining of an overstimulation of touch. Instead, it's the opposite. It's the touch hunger. In contemporary society, that interpersonal touch has been sort of lost for fear of litigation, and yet we have our biggest sense that needs to be stimulated, I think, somehow. I have no choice about the auditory or visual inputs that I'm getting from the environment, but maybe I do have a bit more choice about touch, so I can kind of judge, do I want to stick my hand in on that, feel that surface or not?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. The next sense I'd like to discuss with you is the sense of hearing. So the one that can definitely be overstimulated. And that's one of the main issues these days, I think, in the design. That's something that architects often overlook, unfortunately, and that leads to big problems. But there is also a positive aspect of it, like healing sounds. In restaurants, in bars, in hotels, they also do this sort of branding identity through music.
I mean, it could be music, but I think I'm seeing a lot of the kind of auditory nature effect. So bringing in the sounds of water, bird life, another animal, the sort of waterfall type sounds can help to mask the noise in the office environment. And there's research to suggest, the more varieties of animal sounds you can hear, the more restorative the environment is. And that it doesn't seem to matter so much whether it's real nature you're hearing or just recorded a tape or something. We could create kind of this almost caricatured nature soundscape with all the right number, perfect number of bird species and the right level of water sounds and so on, that might be able to deliver a bigger nature benefit than nature itself. But the fundamental problem is I guess that people aren't necessarily willing to pay for sound. Where I teach here in Oxford, our dining hall is incredibly noisy, can't hear anything when all the students are around. But the thought of paying hundreds of thousands of pounds for noise absorbing panels, it's hard to convince people that that's a price worth paying. And that's also true in the restaurant sector and elsewhere. Hard to justify, and hence more often I guess going to be ignored, and despite a negative health consequence, especially on those who work there, damaging their hearing, but then also on the temporary occupants of that space, making it harder to taste, harder to communicate, leading to stress.
It also seems to me like the sense of hearing is somehow disconnected from the other senses. And I'm saying that because some time ago I organized this kind of sense walks. This was part of the research of my graduation project. I tried to analyze what kind of things people sense when they cross under the highway. And in each place, we tried to sort of diminish all the other senses and really focus on one. And with the sense of hearing, it was really surprising for me that under the highway, it was very silent. Like you actually could feel as if you were in a womb. Like it was considered quite pleasant. So that was quite interesting that you could actually, it can really be comfortable when it's disconnected from the sense of sight, for example.
Potentially, yes. I guess, and I suppose, another way of going back is in time through evolution, but then there's also that kind of line of, the first sounds we heard were in the womb. The sound of the waves crashing on the beach has a similar tempo to the mother's heartbeat. So you might think of that, first sonic environment was this kind of womb sort of with some sound, but does the underpass in some sense replicate that? It's not perfectly silent, but it has sort of a muffled sonic identity. Who knows?
So there's definitely space for proper use when it comes to sense of hearing and architecture. But then with the next one, I do struggle a little bit, which is the sense of taste. I see this one more from the perspective that it's not like we can design with the sense of taste in order to create three-dimensional world, but we can actually create the three-dimensional space that impacts our sense of taste. And by that, I mean, which can stimulate the tasting experience.
And I did manage to come across a few examples of architectural theorists writing about their urge to lick particularly nice bits of Veronese marble or something. And maybe that's just being sort of pretentious nonsense. Or maybe there is something about your tongue being a very sensitive surface, and maybe you can feel, maybe something about marble is a really interesting material. I'm thinking because it sort of looks textured, but it maybe is actually smooth to the touch. So it's kind of a conflict or a contrast there, and that maybe through the tongue, this very sensitive bit of touch, you can reveal something more. So there might be that a little bit of that sense of using the tongue, but there it's really the sense of touch on the tongue rather than the taste of architecture per se. But clearly, again, the other way of saying, oh, how does the environment affect taste? Then I think there is good evidence that it can. And that's sort of built on work that we do called correspondences, which is sort of the surprising connections that we all share between tastes and flavors and shapes and colors and sounds and textures. And so most people we find will associate a round shape with a sweet taste. Oh. And everyone thinks that bitter is angular, sour is an angular shape, and salty also. Sour is kind of asymmetric and angular, bitter is symmetrical and angular, but sweet's the one round one. And hence we're working with designers who create plateware that is, or glassware that is rounder or more angular on the outside in form or in texture with 3D printing or whatever, and that can change the taste. And then going out to say, okay, the shapes of the furniture, of the chairs and sofas, even the shape of the space, can that also affect you? So that would something taste sweeter in a round room than an angular one? Would it taste sweeter if there was a round sofa rather than an angular piece of furniture? And we haven't done the study on that exactly yet. We use it a bit when we do like multi-sensory experiences. We did a Singleton Sensorium in 2013 where we had people tasting whiskey in 3 rooms, and the sweet room had a round floor plan, round furniture, round window panes, pink and purple, the colors of sweetness.
This is fascinating, if that's really the case.
So as well as sort of taking these designs and thinking, well, what would they do to taste of, you know, the furniture or so on, and also the floor plan of the environment. We're also now with colleagues in Japan just analyzing visual images of, say, 50 coffee shops in Japan from the pictures we can find on the web, and then getting people to associate what do you think the coffee would taste like in an environment like that. And we can extract the color properties of the average of the image. We can also potentially extract the angularity in the space, and from that try and figure out what would, if we were designing from the bottom up the perfect environment to bring out sweetness in a drink, then it should be this color, it should be those shapes.
That's really fascinating. That's sort of a connection to the last sense, which is the sense of sight. First thing that came to my mind is obviously the intensity of light, the colors, how we try to get more natural light in, how now there's the whole research on circadian light that has impact on productivity, health as well. Mm-hmm. But I see it can clearly also affect the tasting experience. Mm-hmm. So can we be really talking about subjectivity when we're talking about senses, or is it something that's really general and same for the whole world?
So clearly there are individual differences in preferences. What music you like, I might hate, and vice versa. And clearly there are cultural, historical, regional differences in the meaning and, say, if we're talking about vision, colors, what the funeral color in Japan or China is probably different from the one in the UK or in North America. That said, I think there are also these sort of universals about the visual environment. And so my sort of favorite is on those sort of circadian lights and all the stuff around, was it 460 nanometers blue light of dawn? And that's the blue light of dawn around the world. So that's kind of a universal that we our brains have learned or internalized that when it's that particular shade of blue, it's probably first thing in the morning, it's time to wake up, and hence it alerts us. And if you represent that in a long haul flight terminal or a long distance trucker's bathroom toilet, or in a military jet, it can increase alertness levels. So I think that's going to be kind of a universal. And then the question becomes, okay, which of these visual effects are universal, which are culture specific or trend related? And I'm particularly interested in the moment in sort of Baker Miller pink, this bubblegum pink color. That's a long history in psychology, and I guess sort of some bits of the built environment studies as well. The color that's supposed to calm angry prisoners in prisons and police holding cells. That is supposed to, according to Kendall Jenner, or one of those Jenner sisters, suppress appetite if you paint your kitchen Baker Miller pink, according to an LA exhibit on that. So could that be a universal color? I don't believe it necessarily does either of those things, but I think that sort of that bubblegum pink color is probably the color of skin tones, and so it might have an evolutionarily important role. And there's literature that says if you look in the brain of anybody, our brain doesn't give over equal preference or precedence or importance to all of the hues that we can see, but in fact it gives over a greater bit of the brain just to pinkish red skin tones, because that tells you about the blood flow of other conspecifics, whether they're aggressive, whether they're going to hit you or fight you or I don't know what to you. So is that that sort of the evolutionary importance of those pink hues helping us to determine the emotional state of our conspecifics? Is that also the reason why Baker Miller pink does or doesn't, or has this sort of special status as well? Or is it just coincidence? And then when you think about, it's not just, of course, the hue, but then also saturation and the brightness or lightness. No matter where in the world you are born or grew up, we would associate, brighter light with more alerting, more arousing, more intense. Dimmer light with quieter, more relaxed, sleepier. On that point of using the sort of the visuals for well-being, that gets you kind of right into the world of chromotherapy. So the 1880s, 1890s in North America, UK, books were being written about how various psychological disorders, schizophrenia, depression, could be treated by immersing the patient in an environment of a particular hue. And these books are amazing to read, 130 years later. I think they were probably wrong mostly, but the sort of confidence that you could use the illumination of the built environment to treat conditions, and that maybe you can think of that blue light of dawn as being a hint, a step in that direction. At least you can modulate arousal by color. So I think it does have a long history, and I am sort of seeing today emergence of what's called a sort of snoozelen, one thing about trying to design well-being spaces for patients who've had brain damage or traumatic surgery or something else, and these are sort of like multi-sensory environments that incorporate color and form and scent and texture. But in fact, we could proactively design spaces such that they deliver a more stimulating, a more holistic wellness thing, and actually do good.
Yeah, these are actually questions to address for every architect. And if we could take it a step further, sort of as a conclusion here, what do you think would the built environment actually look like if we took the sensory experiences as a critical design factor? So much more important than structure and form. What kind of world would we live in? What kind of architecture would we live in if we focused on that? I think it would be a very healthy, a very human-related space with really high sort of sense of place.
So I suppose if you sort of followed the argument about biophilia and nature-inspired design to its conclusion, that sort of perfect wellness space would have to look something like the Ethiopian highlands with green and a place to hide and the blue of water and the light. And yeah, I don't think we want to go quite that far.
Well, it could be also very diverse, right? Like there would be maybe rooms where we're trying to, I don't know, rooms for relaxation would be in that specific color with that specific smell. And then, well, we live in a very multifunctional world these days. So my room is my, my office, my living room and my bedroom at the same time, which in terms of senses is also not ideal. Maybe we could divide it.
Yeah, or use, when I think about it, it's that we as individuals, kind of the environment tends to be sort of static in a way. Paint color's not going to change for the next year or two. And yet we as individuals have this sort of circadian diurnal variation, and hence our needs fluctuate over the course of a working day from dawn to dusk. And hence, I sort of thinking about how you design these responsive environments that meet needs, either because men and women are different in terms of their thermal comfort, sure we should be designing for that. And how do we, create the environment or the sort of situation that meets the needs, and maybe even can predict the needs. Probably now, the camera that's picking me up now on the screen could probably do a pretty good job of predicting my emotional state, my tiredness levels. And if that information can be garnered, can be picked up, then how can it be linked to, if I think about sort of, a project I saw in Delft in the design school there a few years ago, with Philips. There's a whole concept, when you come into an environment, when you come home from work, you want to get into one of a range of emotional states. Maybe you're tired, you just want to relax and forget everything. Maybe it's a romantic hot date tonight. Maybe it's entertaining. So you come into this space with different emotional desires. So rather than picking a color, changing the scent, couldn't you just pick the emotion you want? I'm in a party mood, relaxation mood, romantic mood, and then the environment, the lighting color will change. One of those Philips color changing hues. The plug-in scent dispenser will switch its cartridge. The sound system will pick Barry White or something else, depending on that. In that case, the individual had to choose what is it I want. But nowadays we can't be so far from sort of intelligent technology being able to pick up those things and hence almost seamlessly adapt to my needs and functionally deliver to get me to where it thinks I should be going.
Yeah, and I think this example of yours that you just mentioned, it again explains why it's so important to think about all the senses holistically. And for now in architecture, we deal with acoustics, we talk with an acoustic expert, then we choose the lamps, then we choose tables, and then the project is done instead of actually looking at it as one big multisensory experience that we could approach and address maybe with the same elements. It doesn't have to be just a mix or a collection of things that's just put inside the box.
Of course, in one way it gets a bit more complicated as soon as you say, the senses are interacting with each other. So I cannot really figure out the acoustic environment without figuring out how bright, how light space is. I can't figure out how bright it will look to you without understanding the noise levels, because these are interacting. Your thermal comfort is not just a matter of I can't pick that up perfectly from the ambient temperature. It depends on the paint color, and so it goes on. So the fact that all the senses are kind of they're not necessarily having a huge impact on the others, but they are having a significant impact on the other senses, means that again one might want to agitate for the sort of holistic approach with those with the complexities that brings.
I think that's a great conclusion of our talk, and I really hope we as architects are going to learn from people like you to design better spaces.
I'm not a designer, I can't create anything. I can just measure stuff and have ideas about what might affect you and how. But more of my sort of design colleagues are saying that no longer is it sufficient to say I am the designer, I'm creative. You can't measure what I do. I just think it's right, and that's it. More and more of their clients are saying, no, prove it to me. Prove that it does what you say. And I think we are in a stage now where a lot more experimentation can be done, and that there is this kind of really nice, also tense sometimes, but sort of collaboration, interplay between sort of scientific stuff and then the creative design elements, and how one can help the other, constrain the other, but also together it will make you feel better. That can be measured now.
Yeah, which is exactly what I'm advocating for, and that's why the whole 4D brainstorm started. Okay, thank you so much for the talk. I mean, everything you said was just mind-blowing for me, so I'll definitely follow what you're doing. I hope everyone who's going to listen to it will also follow, because there's a lot already done and a lot to still be discovered. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Nice evening. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to share your thoughts on the topic, just find me on Instagram at 4dbrainstorm, or simply send an email to 4dbrainstorm@gmail.com. I'm happy to keep discussing it further. If you're interested to know more about what I do, you can also check out 4dbrainstorm.com, a platform for free brainstorming in all dimensions and fields. Join the brainstorm and let's discover the fourth dimension together. Till next time!